Marcus Sullivan's hands trembled as he stared at the crumpled piece of paper on his mahogany desk. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 47th floor, but for the first time in 20 years, the storm outside felt less fierce than the one raging in his chest. How could 9 simple words from a homeless man change everything he thought he knew about success? Can you read this letter? It's very important. Those words had been spoken just 3 hours ago, but they felt like a lifetime. Marcus had built his empire on numbers, on cold calculations, and ruthless efficiency. He'd fired thousands, demolished communities for profit, and crushed competitors without a second thought. At 52, he was worth $3.2 billion, owned homes on 3 continents, and commanded respect from world leaders. Yet sitting there, rain-soaked and shaken, he felt poorer than he'd ever been in his life. It had started as the worst day of his career. The board meeting that morning had been a disaster. His latest acquisition, a chain of small-town newspapers, was hemorrhaging, money faster than he'd anticipated. His shareholders were furious. His wife had served him divorce papers that morning, and his only son hadn't spoken to him in 2 years. As he'd stormed out of the building, loosening his $300 tie, Marcus had decided to walk home instead of taking his usual limousine. He needed air, needed to think, needed to figure out how to salvage what was left of his crumbling world. The rain had started suddenly, a torrential downpour that sent New Yorkers scrambling for cover. Marcus had ducked under a construction scaffolding near Central Park, cursing his decision to walk. That's when he'd noticed him, an elderly black man huddled in a wheelchair, a tattered military jacket draped over his thin shoulders, rain dripping from the brim of a worn baseball cap. "Excuse me, sir," the man had called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Can you read this letter? It's very important." Marcus had almost ignored him. He had a company to save, a fortune to protect, problems that dwarfed whatever this homeless veteran might need. But something in the man's eyes, a desperate hope mixed with deep exhaustion, made him pause. "What letter?" Marcus had asked, stepping closer. The man's weathered hands shook as he reached into a plastic bag beside his wheelchair, carefully extracting an envelope that had been sealed inside multiple layers of protection. The paper was yellowed with age, the writing on the front faded but legible. "To my daddy, from your little angel. My daughter wrote this before she—" The man's voice broke. "Before she passed. Cancer took her when she was just 12. That was 15 years ago. I can't read, sir. Never learned how. I've been carrying this letter ever since, asking people to read it to me. But," he gestured at his surroundings, his homeless condition, "people don't stop. They don't see me. You're the first person in months who's even listened." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. The man's name was Walter Jenkins, he learned. Walter had served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home to work in a factory that closed when companies moved jobs overseas. His wife died of a heart attack when their medical bills became overwhelming, and he'd been on the streets for 3 years. Through it all, he'd kept that letter safe, desperate to know his daughter's final words. With hands that felt foreign to him, Marcus carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside was decorated, with crayon drawings of stick, figures holding hands under a rainbow. The handwriting was that of a child, uneven but filled with love. "Dear Daddy, I know I'm sick and might go to heaven soon, but I want you to know something very important. You are the best daddy in the whole world. Remember when you worked extra shifts to buy me that bike for my birthday? And how you sang to me every night when I was scared? And how you always said kindness is the most important thing? Daddy, I want you to promise me something. Even when I'm gone, keep being kind to everyone you meet. Help people who need help. Share your smile even when you're sad. Because kindness is like a magic that never dies. It keeps going from person to person forever. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Your little angel, Sarah." By the time Marcus finished reading, both men were crying. Walter sobbed openly, finally hearing his daughter's voice after 15 years of silence. But Marcus wept for different reasons. He cried for the man he'd become, for the kindness he'd buried under ambition, for all the people he'd stepped on during his climb to the top. "She was right, you know," Walter whispered through his tears. About kindness being magic. Even after all these years, all this pain, hearing those words, it's like she's still here, still teaching me. Marcus couldn't speak. He thought about his own son, Michael, who'd stopped calling because Marcus was always too busy, always choosing work over family dinners, always promising next time until next time never came. He thought about the thousands of employees he'd laid off, without ever considering their faces, their families, their dreams. The rain began to slow, and Marcus made a decision that would change everything. "Walter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you like to get some dinner? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." That evening, over coffee and sandwiches in a small diner, Marcus learned about Walter's life, his struggles, his dreams, his unwavering faith in human goodness despite everything he'd endured. In return, Marcus found himself sharing his own story. The loneliness of success, the emptiness of accumulating wealth while losing everything that mattered. "Your daughter was wise," Marcus said finally. "Kindness really is magic. I'd forgotten that. I'd forgotten a lot of things." 6 months later, the business world was buzzing about Marcus Sullivan's dramatic transformation. He'd restructured his entire company around a new mission. Instead of closing down the small-town newspapers he'd acquired, he'd invested millions in revitalizing them, creating jobs and strengthening communities. He'd established the Sarah Jenkins Foundation, funding literacy programs and homeless services across the country. Walter had become the foundation's first board member and Marcus's closest advisor. But the changes weren't just professional. Marcus had reconciled with his son, spending weekends teaching Michael to fish instead of reviewing quarterly reports. He'd simplified his life, keeping just one modest home and donating the rest to housing charities. His ex-wife, seeing the genuine change in him, had agreed to try couples counseling. Every morning, Marcus kept Sarah's letter, now framed, on his desk as a reminder. He'd had it reproduced and distributed to every employee with a simple message. "Kindness is the most important business strategy we have." The company's profits had actually increased since the transformation. Turns out when you treat employees with respect, invest in communities, and lead with compassion, people respond with loyalty and hard work. Marcus had discovered what Walter and Sarah had always known. Kindness wasn't just magic. It was profitable magic. On the first anniversary of their meeting, Marcus visited Walter in his new apartment, a comfortable place Marcus had helped him find. Though Walter insisted on paying his own rent with his job at the foundation's literacy center. "You know what's funny?" Walter said as they sat on his small balcony watching the sunset. "I spent 15 years asking people to read Sarah's letter, hoping to hear her voice again. I never imagined that letter would end up changing someone else's life too." Marcus smiled, thinking about the ripple effects of that rainy day. The foundation had helped thousands of people learn to read, had housed hundreds of homeless veterans, had saved dozens of small newspapers and the communities they served. Sarah's words about kindness being magic that keeps going from person to person had proven prophetic. "Your daughter was right about everything," Marcus said. "Kindness really does keep going forever. One letter, one act of compassion, one moment of seeing someone else's humanity. It all adds up to something bigger than we can imagine." As darkness fell over the city, Marcus thought about tomorrow's board meeting, where he'd announce the foundation's expansion into education programs for underprivileged children. He thought about his dinner plans with Michael, about the literacy volunteer training he'd attend that weekend, about the simple joy of a life lived in service to others. The storm that had raged in his chest that rainy day had finally passed, replaced by something he'd never experienced in all his years of ruthless success. Peace. Real, lasting peace that came not from what he could accumulate, but from what he could give away. In the end, 9 simple words from a homeless veteran had done what billions of dollars couldn't. They'd made Marcus Sullivan rich in all the ways that truly mattered. And somewhere, he liked to think, a little girl's spirit smiled, knowing her magic was still spreading kindness throughout the world, one heart at a time.